President names this designee, who is empowered to bring all of the stakeholders of any auto manufacturer that receives this bridge financing. The President's designee is empowered to bring all of those stakeholders, creditors, dealerships, bondholders, labor unions, management, to bring all of those people together for a set period of time to see whether they can negotiate a plan for long-term viability. The statute sets very clear definitions for what constitutes long-term viability and requires the President's designee to ultimately make a certification as to whether that definition is met. This is really important to us, that this not be just an arbitrary or sort of discretionary judgment about what a good firm looks like. This is an economic definition of what it means to be long-term viable. I can talk about that in some detail, but simply stated, it's that the firm will have a positive value going forward when you take into account all of its costs. That's what it means to be a viable firm in the absence of continuing federal support. And that's the goal of this legislation, firm definition in there. Now, how does the process work? It was very important to us that there be, that this President's designee have sticks, leverage, to make sure that all of these stakeholders who are participating in the process of negotiations have a very strong incentive to make the deep and meaningful concessions that would be necessary for these companies to become viable over the long term. So there are a number of sticks. The first is if these companies do not arrive in the negotiations at a plan that meets the test for long-term viability, that bridge financing shall be called by the President's designee. That means we get paid back at the end of the period. The period is until March 31st or April 30th if the President's designee wants to grant a one-time 30-day extension because they're making progress and there's a likelihood of success. So at the end of that period, if there's not a plan that makes these firms viable, the government gets its money back. Now, remember what I said at the outset, that this is a bridge to either fundamental restructuring or bankruptcy. They either have a long-term plan that's viable or we get our money back. And if we call our money back, which is required under this bill, then those firms are not going to be able to survive. That is a real incentive and a real stick for this President's designee to ensure that these stakeholders all across the board make the concessions that are necessary. That was critically important to us, and we achieved that in this agreement. A couple of other sticks. If they fail to achieve a negotiated plan for long-term viability, the President's designee will be required to submit his own. And the language will explicitly state that that can include a plan for reorganization under Chapter 11, which is, again, one of the mechanisms that many people have suggested could be required for these firms to achieve viability and would need to happen if they're not able to achieve viability on their own through voluntary concessions by the various stakeholders. And finally, the last stick is that at the end of this period for negotiation, if there is no plan that satisfies the conditions for long-term viability, there is an explicit prohibition put in the legislation against any federal financing being used to help these firms avoid bankruptcy or to achieve financial viability. So those are three extremely powerful tools that ensure what I said at the outset. This gives these firms a chance to make these concessions voluntarily. But if they don't, the alternative path is quite clear. And that was very important to us. Now, and I believe very important to the American people. A couple other things which we can talk about if you want. There are very strong taxpayer protections of the kind that you've seen in other programs recently. And things like executive compensation, strong executive compensation restrictions, and warrant requirements and the like. I can provide a little bit more detail on that if you want, although, again, the text is not final. I think I'll stop there and throw it open. Any questions? Ben?
Joel, a couple questions, please. Conservative Republicans in the Senate are threatening to block the measure, assuming it gets that far. What is the White House doing to try to address their concerns and win them over?
It's a good question. Look, there are a lot of people with concerns about this legislation. We've had concerns about the legislation, and we wanted to make sure that it was tough and that this was not a bridge financing to nowhere. That we could look these members in the eye and we could look the American people in the eye and say that this measure gives these companies a chance and their stakeholders a chance, but it's not a lifeline to continue with bad management and a bad business plan. We're going to go make that same case to the Senate Republicans, the House Republicans, and the Democrats, for that matter, who also are going to need to be called upon to vote for this. I expect there will be difficult questions. We're prepared to answer them, and we think that when they look at the bill in the context that I've just described and compare it to the alternatives, they'll think this is the right thing for our economy in a difficult time and the right thing for our country. We'll be talking retail to individual senators to try to win their support. We've also got the Chief of Staff, Josh Bolten, going up to address the Senate Republican conference in a couple hours. So, we understand that this is a very difficult issue for everybody involved. We think we've come up with the right solution, and we're going to try to persuade members of Congress from both sides that that's the case.
How about President Bush? Is he going to get personally involved?
I expect you'll see the president talk to various members as he thinks it's necessary or the staff advises him. This is an important measure, and we're going to try to get it passed. Yes, sir.
What are the executive compensation restrictions?
There's a whole bunch of them, and they're very significant. They track what you've seen in the TARP legislation and its implementation. There's a lot of them, and they apply to the top executives in the firm to make sure that they're not receiving bonuses that are not commensurate with the performance of the firm, especially while they're getting these loans. We can get them for you afterwards, what was in the TARP legislation, but I think everybody over the last few months has understood how important it is that there be very serious executive compensation provisions when the taxpayers' money is involved and the American people are being asked to support firms that up until now have not made meaningful, necessary, tough decisions. Yes.
Just a point of clarification when you say that option number 2.
All right, that was White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy Joel Kaplan talking there about the plan for automakers, saying that it has to be either a bridge to viability or to bankruptcy. Some pretty strong language.